I don't know how many of you have ever thought about it before, but the Jewish people are arguably the oldest group of people still in existence today, dating all the way back to 12,000 BCE. Given all that they've endured throughout their long history, this point alone is astonishing. But just as remarkable is that their ancient beliefs and writings remain central to the lives of billions of people, having become part of the sacred scriptures for three of the world's major religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And in many ways, I find it incredibly disturbing that so many still follow these ancient and primitive writings based on myth and superstition, rather than depending more upon the superior knowledge we've gained from reason and science during just the past couple of centuries. Still, I cannot help but be in awe of such extraordinary endurance. Of course, there are a lot of ancient writings and stories that are of equal or greater benefit, but these are so only because we regard them with less reverence than we do the Hebrew Scriptures and its later spin-offs, Christianity's New Testament, Islam's Quran, and most recently, the Book of Mormon. None of us, for example, worships Plato because of his writings, nor devote ourselves to the wisdom of Socrates, whom he wrote about. We haven't fashioned a religion based on either, nor do we carry about the Apology or the Republic or other such writings in leather-bound, gold-leafed books. We may name our planets after ancient gods: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and so on, and some spacecrafts: Mercury, Apollo, Artemis, along with giving them to our pets and some automobiles and other things, but not because we worship them or believe that any of them are real. When we hear one of Aesop's fables, like the one about the lion talking with the mouse, or Greek myths like the one about Zeus giving birth to Athena out of his forehead, we don't take them literally, not any more than we do most ancient fables or myths. Yet not taking these tales to be historically or literally true doesn't mean that they aren't meaningful. Plato's philosophy and Aesop's fables provide us with much insight into our own morals, and Greek mythology into human psychology. Yet again, we don't make a religion out of them, even though they can be far more beneficial in helping us cope with reality than religion often can. And from my experience, it's only once these ancient writings and religious beliefs are liberated from their literal interpretations that they become truly meaningful. It's when they are allowed into the deep well of humanity's archetypal collective unconscious, along with our other myths and images, where we are free to play with their meaning, that they become worth paying attention to. So it is with the stories and teachings attributed to Jesus. Like many, I consider them to be based on a historical person who lived in Judea approximately 2,000 years ago, who we can know little more about than that with confidence. All that has ever been written about him is questionable, and most of it is obviously untrue. The Jesus written of in the Christian scriptures is a fictional character. He's not the product of an immaculate conception or virgin birth, did not perform a single miracle, did not die for our sins, did not rise from the dead or ascend to heaven, and most certainly will not return one day with a double-edged sword hanging from his mouth. Even so, there are many in our modern world today who would be angry to hear me say such things, and many in the past who would have had my head or burned me alive for doing so. They think that I am diminishing their stories about Jesus by saying such things. But in my view, I'm liberating them so that they can become truly relevant. As relevant as philosophy and the fables of Aesop remain. As a Westerner, and more importantly, as a former Christian and Southern Baptist minister, Christian mythology was central to my education and is more meaningful to me now than ever, especially because I no longer take any of it literally. When working on my master's degree, my theology professor, Dr. Adeline Farabach, a Catholic nun and an accomplished Bible scholar, used to tell her first-year Bible students, if it's written in the Bible, you can pretty much rest assured it never happened. In recent years, the Jesus Seminar, comprised of hundreds of scholars who, after years of research, determined that less than 20% of all that has been written about Jesus may be true. But even that much is uncertain. They are far more certain of the other 80% that never happened. By saying so, however, it is not my intention nor theirs to diminish these writings, but to put them in proper perspective so that we can free our minds to find real value in them. Our Unitarian and therefore humanistic interpretation of Jesus moves us only to admire, not worship him. And more importantly, to practice what he preached, to live justly. So that religion ought to be good for humanity, not humanity for religion. And that this principle is put into practice by treating others as we would be treated, and by sharing our wealth and our resources with one another, by feeding the hungry, healing the sick, caring for the poor, forgiving one another, welcoming outcasts, the unclean, the demonized among us, and avoiding violence in our relationships. These are the teachings that Thomas Jefferson, a Unitarian, was referring to when he said, "The doctrines which flowed from the lips of Jesus himself are within the comprehension of a child. But the thousands of volumes that have not yet explained the Platonisms engrafted on them, and for this reason, that nonsense can never be explained." It's true that those teachings about loving our neighbor, putting away our swords, and turning the other cheek take no leap of imagination for us to understand and agree with and value, whether Jesus ever actually said them or not. It was, if we discovered evidence that he never said any of them, they would remain just as meaningful. If we discovered evidence that he never existed, they would remain just as meaningful. Consider all the wisdom, for example, expressed in the fictional character Al-Mustafa in Khalil Gibran's book, The Prophet. We know at the outset the prophet is a fictional character, yet so many of the words attributed to him in this slim book are rightly considered among the wisest and most practical ever written. But what I want to focus on here today are not the few literal truths attributed to Jesus, but some of the nonsense. Because I disagree with Thomas Jefferson about the nonsense. The nonsense can be even more meaningful than the sense. Right? We don't need to delve deeply into the sense to understand it or where it originates from. So long, that is, as we don't take the nonsense literally. Taking nonsense literally is what robs it of its genuine meaning. Understanding that it is nonsense to begin with frees us to play with it and to find meaning in it for ourselves, which, it should be understood, is different from finding the true meaning or discovering what it must mean for everyone else too. That would just be another way of trying to make it literally true. For example, there are several stories about Jesus casting out demons that we know cannot be true because there's no such thing as demons, let alone demon possession, despite the movie The Exorcist having scared the hell out of me. So, what do such stories mean? What did their authors mean by them? Maybe they meant them as metaphors. Maybe they believed that they were true. Maybe they were referring to some serious diseases they didn't understand, like schizophrenia or epilepsy. We'll never know what they meant. But I can tell you what they mean to me. To me, they mean that we ought to accept those who have been demonized, especially those who have been demonized by some authority, be it our government, a lot of that going around today, our society, a lot of that going around today, or some self-righteous organization, UUA. There's a story in the Gospel of Luke, for example, where Jesus encounters a man said to be possessed who had been, quote, chained hand and foot and kept under guard, indicating he had been confined by the authorities. What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God, the demonized man says. I beg you, do not torment me, for Jesus had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. What is your name, Jesus asked. Legion, he replies, for many demons had entered him. They begged him not to order them back into the abyss. For me, the name Legion means that he had many concerns that tormented him, concerns that he wanted to discuss, for which he was ostracized and punished, demonized, making his existence abysmal. You ever been in an abysmal place, not wanting to go back? Please don't send me back to that abysmal place. Demonizing those with whom we disagree is, in my view, the most common way that people attempt to win arguments these days. This is always done with the intention of silencing their opponents by discrediting them, a tactic used no matter which side of the issues they are on. Texas Governor Greg Abbott recently referred to those who questioned the state's poor response to last week's deadly floods as losers. Ask a question, you're a loser. And when a reporter asked President Trump about the warnings and alerts not arriving in time to save hundreds of lives, he responded that only a bad person would ask a question like that. Only a very evil person would ask a question like that. When such behavior occurs on the extreme left nowadays, we call it cancel culture, or being canceled, which includes disinviting and displatforming speakers whose ideas we don't want to hear or allow others to hear. No matter the ideology behind it, the intent is always to silence opponents by discrediting them, even if it means ruining their reputations and livelihoods. In some cases, that's the intention. And this is usually because the arguments of those condemning them are as indefensible as they are irrational and can't stand up to rational discourse. In his book, Parables as Subversive Speech, theologian William Herzog says the same was true in Jesus' day, that demonizing others, in his words, was a form of social control. In effect, this labeling degrades the possessed by destroying their selfhood and denying that they have experienced and denying what they have experienced and expressed in their fits of possession. So the stories of Jesus' encounters with those who had been demonized are among my very favorites because they remind the rest of us not to fall for it and to protect the speech and the voices of those who have been demonized, canceled, disinvited, or otherwise silenced, whether we agree with them or not. Because we prize the freedom of speech, not just for those we disagree with, but as a principle to live by. But this takes some courage, because cancel cooties, as I call them, are considered extremely contagious. Nobody wants to catch the dreaded disease of guilt by association and end up like those who have already been made examples of. There's even a story of Jesus himself being demonized for liberating those who had been demonized themselves by effectively declaring them perfectly sane and thus legitimizing what they have to say. It's only by Beelzebub, the prince of demons, these religious authorities declared, that this fellow drives out demons. Guilt by association. But Jesus didn't care about cancel cooties. He even healed those with leprosy, a highly contagious and horrific disease, by touching them. By touching them. In his society, the lepers were considered both physically and spiritually unclean and were therefore untouchable, cursed by God. Yet Jesus wasn't afraid to touch them, or even of the stigma of touching them, along with those who were declared untouchable for other reasons. That's the metaphor here, that we heal the untouchable simply by touching them, caring for them, treating them with the dignity and the compassion that they, like all human beings, deserve. I'm reminded of the AIDS epidemic in our own time, during the worst period of which, at the beginning, people feared coming into contact with those who had been infected. Until effective medications came along, those with the illness would die horribly, no matter how they were treated. But the real suffering for many of them was being alone and despised and misunderstood when they most needed to be held and loved and touched. And that's the miracle. That's how the miracle is performed, that just like Jesus, each of us has that power within the palm of our hand and in the tips of our fingers to touch the lives of those who most need us to touch them, who most need a handout or a hand up or a handshake, letting them know that they belong and that they are not alone. That's how that miracle is performed. That's how that healing takes place. Jesus, the stories say, was often criticized for publicly associating with the demonized, unclean, and other untouchables of his day, including women whom men were not supposed to openly engage with, an offense that could get both condemned. Yet there are many stories of him doing so, including having women among his disciples, something the church has conveniently forgot. Coming into physical contact with a woman who was menstruating, shocking, scandalous. It's made her especially unclean in the eyes of others. Speaking with non-Jewish women on the streets, and associating with those considered prostitutes, whether they were or not. And by the way, he would have associated with them, whether they were or not. One of my very favorite stories is the story of a woman described as bent over and unable to stand up straight, who abruptly approaches Jesus while he's teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, an all-male meeting. Although her actions were forbidden and scandalous, guess what he does? Jesus takes her by the hands and says, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." Afterward, the other men criticize him for doing so, but Jesus defends his behavior, referring to the woman as a daughter of Abraham. As a daughter of Abraham, a play on a term that was used exclusively for males, sons of Abraham. For Jewish males, sons of Abraham. But the real miracle here isn't performed by Jesus, but by the woman herself, who has finally gotten so bent out of shape, as theologian Walter Wink says, that she finally finds the fortitude to stand erect in a male religious space. In short, the miracle was her standing up for herself against misogyny and inequality, proving that she is as worthy and capable of entering the synagogue or anywhere else as any man. Another such story, which is most certainly a work of fiction, but beautiful, is found in the Gospel of John, about a woman who is about to be stoned to death for the crime of adultery. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. As Jesus approaches, he is immediately put to the test, reminded of the rules, right? The laws, the law requires that they both must be put to death. What do you say, holy man? Jesus responds brilliantly. Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. After the appropriately chastened crowd disperses, Jesus is left alone with this frightened and embarrassed woman. He then utters what to me are the most remarkable and moving words in this entire story, perhaps among the most moving in the entire Christian scriptures. Where are your accusers? Where are your accusers? Implying that between the two of them, there is no one left to judge her. That she is safe with him. It's another example of radical acceptance, in this case of not judging others, especially those that our society tells us we must condemn and exclude. Don't do it. Get the cancel cooties. It's worth it. I especially enjoy a line at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, which introduces Jesus to us as an adult, as he's being baptized. That's how it starts. No miracle birth stories. And just as he was coming up out of the water, it says, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. And a voice came from heaven, you are my Son, beloved, with you I am well pleased. And in this moment, Jesus has a religious epiphany by realizing that no matter what anyone else says about him, no matter what anyone else thinks about him, he too is a child of God, which means that he deserves the same dignity and respect as anybody else. And that, in essence, became his good news, that all of us are both a son of God and a son of man, That is, all of us are God's children and human beings who deserve to be treated as such, no matter what society says about us, no matter who wants to demonize us and silence us. I'm reminded further of the entire point of William James' classic book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. He begins this monumental work about religion by saying, I speak not now of your ordinary religious believer who follows the conventional observances of his country, whether it be Buddhist, Christian, or Mohammedan. His religion has been made for him by others, communicated to him by tradition, determined to fixed forms by imitation, and retained by habit, which he goes on to call a second-hand religious life that it would profit us little to study. Now, this is incredibly astonishing, given that his book, published in 1902, is still considered one of the most seminal works on religion ever written. Yet right from the start, in a book written about religion, that is considered one of the greatest books about religion ever written, says it won't benefit us to consider the world's major religions. If we're going to talk about religion, let's not talk about religions, which he doesn't mention again except for that one line in his introduction. And it's one of those, those thick, turn of the century books, 9-point font and 8-point footnotes that are 3 pages long themselves, Now, this is so because James believed that only individuals can have authentic religious experiences. Religions, on the other hand, are invented when people try to emulate or imitate the authentic religious experiences of others, which they cannot experience for themselves as much as they may try. Jesus' religious epiphany came in the realization of his own worth and humanity, right? Something he deeply felt all of a sudden. No matter what they say, I'm worth something. I have value. I'm an equal. And insight, according to the stories, that he simply wanted to help others realize about themselves. But to truly get it, they'd have to experience something like it for themselves. They'd have to become true believers in themselves. But instead of being a religion based on the good news that every person has worth and dignity, as Jesus taught, his experience was turned into a religion that worshiped him and worshiped his experience. Instead of teaching us that we are all God's children and equals among men, Christianity became a religion about the only Son of God and the only Son of Man, which is not what he talked about. That's second-hand religion, not an authentic religious experience. The result has often been that rather than emulating Jesus' radical acceptance of and care for outcasts, rather than working for justice, Christianity has been used to justify condemning those who think and behave in unorthodox ways. Perhaps this is why Nietzsche once lamented that the only person who may have actually practiced what Jesus preached died on a cross. But just because these stories are not historically or literally true, and that Jesus, as he is portrayed in the scriptures, is a complete work of fiction, right? Even if there was a real human being named Jesus, the person portrayed in the scriptures is a complete work of fiction. But this doesn't mean that there is no value to contemplating them, so long as we don't depend on others to tell us what they mean or expect others to accept what we say they mean. It is precisely because they cannot be taken historically or literally true that we are free to peer more deeply into them and discover what they might mean to us as individuals that enable us to have our own authentic religious experiences. So here I have focused on those stories emphasizing welcoming the outcast among us, because that's something that touches me. You might see something entirely different, like how Jesus seemed to be inspired by nature, or how he confronted those systems of economic and social injustice, or something about his spirituality and so forth. You may even see and discover something that nobody else ever has that's meaningful to you. As I've already said, as Unitarians, we value those teachings attributed to Jesus that remind us to care for one another by sharing our resources, feeding the hungry, healing the sick, caring for the poor, welcoming the outcast. But we don't need a story to realize that these things are true. We already know they're true. In our hearts, if anything, we project that meaning onto the story. But there are many such truths within us that we need to get out, that we can get out, that are not so obvious, waiting to rise to the surface of our awareness. Sometimes the best way to get at them, is to contemplate the images and the myths and the fables that have persisted throughout time, including those tall tales about a fictional man named Jesus. So feel free to go out and play with him, metaphorically speaking, of course. Thank you.